This video will be part 1 of Chapter 5 Survey Research for PSY 222 Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. Especially in my subfield of social psychology, we are heavily involved in survey research, the use of questionnaires as tools, the use of interviews, and a variety of other tools and techniques that really rely on collecting data through survey methodology. In psychology as a whole, probably the most heavily used methodology is the survey technique. So it's important that you get a grounding in how psychologists use survey methodologies to answer questions, and also that you learn some of the limitations of this approach. Surveys are used for a whole lot of different purposes. Probably what comes to mind most directly when I say the word survey to you is instruments such as questionnaires that are used to assess thoughts, opinions, beliefs, values, feelings. We also can use these types of methods in order to assess other kinds of constructs within psychology as well. Social scientists, not just psychologists, use surveys for a lot of reasons. Some of it is convenience and ease. Some of it is because we can collect a lot of data from a lot of people with more easily, more quickly, more efficiently by using survey methodologies. In other cases, it's theoretical reasons driving why we are using survey techniques. Sometimes it's more applied. If I'm a political scientist and I'm trying to understand political attitudes, you have to ask the electorate, and that means using some kind of survey technique. Surveys can sometimes be very specific and focused on very specific interests or topics. They can also be very broad, and it really depends on the type of research question and the scope of the research. One of the questions that always arises when we talk about survey research is the question of whether or not results are biased in some way. And answering that question, that's a question that's going to come up more than once during this chapter. You really have to look at bias coming from a number of different sources. Sometimes it's in the structure and construction of the tools that you're using in your survey research. In other cases, it's bias from the researcher themselves. Sometimes it's in the nature of the questions that are being asked. Sometimes it's all of those. So, as your authors put it, the best way to determine if results of a particular piece of survey research are biased is to really dig down into the particular procedures used to collect data and the nature of the analyses that were conducted using the data that you pulled from the survey. One kind of bias that your authors mention is looking underneath the hood. So if you're listening to the news or you hear about a survey that's a national survey, I hear about these pretty often if I'm listening to NPR on the radio, which I do habitually. The reporters may say a survey was conducted and showed X, Y, and Z. The scientist in me says, now who paid for that research? Was that grant funded through the government? Was that sponsored by a private organization? Was it paid for by individuals? And why do we ask these questions? We ask these questions because it goes to what are the motivations of the researchers involved. If, for example, you find out that there's a research project that shows positive results of a particular drug for treating a given disease, but then you look under the hood and you see that the drug company that markets and manufactures and sells the drug actually paid for the trial that showed the positive results. That raises a question in your mind as the consumer of that information. Was there bias in the process? And it's not necessarily that there would be bias, it's just that there's a question that's raised and you have to use an extra level of scrutiny, and the company doing the research would have to be even more transparent than they would normally, in order to assure those who are looking at that data that the study was not biased. Beyond those considerations, the real critical issue in deciding whether or not you have a sample that can be counted on is really looking at the tools that were used, both in terms of actually asking and answering questions, but also how the analyses were done, how the sample was generated, and so on. So all of those factors about how you design the method for collecting the information, how do you actually interact with participants, how did you find your participants, and how did you analyze your data, all of those are potential sources of bias. So if you're a critical consumer of survey information, you're going to ask those questions. I often find myself as a social scientist frustrated by news reports of survey data when they don't report a way of accessing, the structure of the questionnaires that were used, when they don't give complete information about the nature of the data analysis, or they don't give simple statistical information such as the effect size of a difference, such that you can do a critical kind of analysis of what the findings might mean. So with some of those opening kind of thoughts in mind, where we're saying, we need to be careful in thinking about bias and how that might impact how much faith we have in survey results, it doesn't mean that you should just toss out survey data and claim that it is no good because it's vulnerable to bias. Well, all research is vulnerable to bias. Your job as a student of psychology is to be aware of sources of bias such that you can identify them and then make critical decisions afterwards. So we'll leave bias for a moment. Now we need to talk about the characteristics of surveys so that you can get a proper orientation to what survey research involves. And I will say there are a lot of words that are often used interchangeably here. The word survey is often poorly defined. Even among social scientists, we don't necessarily use the word survey carefully in terms of what it represents. Same goes for questionnaire as a word, as a term. And then you throw in the word scale and you've got a whole nother world of confusion. I'm hoping to be able to clarify some of that as we move forward. So first, when you're talking about survey research, what you're talking about is not so much the tools, like, for instance, a questionnaire or a scale, that you're going to have people respond to. The survey means more globally, you're going to take a sample of people and ask them questions. It doesn't specify the specific tools you're going to use in order to do that. You may use a questionnaire. You may use a psychometric scale. You may use an interview. You may use a focus group. Regardless, what you're doing when you survey is you're pulling a sample from a population in order to test whatever hypotheses you have or to describe a phenomenon in detail. Another characteristic of surveys is that you have a predetermined set of questions that all of your participants are going to respond to. So again, regardless of the tool that you use, it could be a questionnaire, it could be a standardized scale, it could be an interview, you're going to ask the same questions of all participants. So that you can then summarize that data and have the sample that you've pulled meaningfully represent a population. We have oral responding, written responding, and now in the age of the survey monkeys of the world, computer entered responses in the form of internet surveys. Basically, the questions that you ask, regardless of what form you're talking about, that's the data that we are acquiring when we do survey research. Our goal is typically to find a representative group of people. And when we talk about representative, what we mean is you have a population. If you're the researcher, you have a population in mind. And you want to pull a subset of that population. If I'm a political scientist, it's an election year, and I want a survey to represent the electorate in the state of Ohio, I'm going to have to go in and learn something about the demographics of the state of Ohio, and then intentionally design a sampling procedure that allows me to pull, say, 1,000 out of the far more than that population of voting age in the state of Ohio. I'm going to pull, say, 1,000 people, but have their percentages in terms of how they fit the demographic criteria, have those percentages be representative in terms of, say, age or race or employment status, political party identification, gender, and so on. So a representative sample that then responds to that same set of questions, what that allows you to do when you're using a survey is to make some global general statements about the population from which the sample was drawn. Now you can see that there are some assumptions that are being made here. Number one, that you can get a representative sample, and that's often the biggest challenge in survey research. It also assumes that you've done a good job of understanding the underlying demographics of the population you're interested in. And finally, that people equally across those representative at the elements, the demographic groupings within a population, that they're going to respond equally, such that they remain representative. Those are all kind of caveats that make survey research simultaneously interesting and frustrating. Why do we use the same questions for every respondent? Because we want to have the capacity to say that we are able to make general statements about, say, groups within a given population. How do they differ in terms of, if I'm a political scientist again, if I have different people of different, let's say, age groupings within the electorate, how are their voting patterns different? So I've pulled a representative sample and I compare those two subsamples within the group. They need to have been answering the same questions for me to be able to compare them. Asking the same questions also allows us to compare attitudes at different times. I've seen a lot of reports or heard a lot of reports of what's different now in terms of voting patterns in comparison to 2016. So there are many polls out that are using essentially the exact same survey instruments, the same questionnaires, asking the same questions in the lead up to the 2016 election. They're repeating those questions now in 2020 so that they can make a direct comparison. Sampling obviously is a really essential component of survey research. When we think about how sampling works, first, you have to carefully choose your population of interest. And sometimes there are practical matters that determine what population you're going to be restricted to. Like my student researchers, when they do their SCEs, they are often restricted to using college students as a broad population, but their sampling base is restricted to Mount Union. So therefore they have a pretty restricted population of interest there. You also have to make decisions about exactly who is going to respond to your survey questions. And you might find, again, my SCE students often find themselves faced with a very restricted sample of students at Mount Union, and often students at Mount Union whose professors are offering them extra credit for participating. Now, in other forms of research, those decisions aren't forced on us. We have to, as researchers, decide who am I going to target with invitations. So, for example, I'm currently in data collection for a sabbatical research project where I'm interested in getting, it's a survey project, and I want to get the attitudes and beliefs and experiences of people who provide foster care for dogs. So I started out, my population of interest is people who do foster care with dogs. And then I had to, refine that a bit. People who have in the past or who are currently fostering dogs for rescues or um, uh, dog pounds or the Humane Society and so on. In deciding who should respond to the survey, I've had to use not a particularly representative approach because volunteers are often very difficult to reach in terms of having, there's no comprehensive list of dog fosters that I can access and then systematically pull a random sample from. So since that fact is true, what I've been doing is sending invitations to Facebook groups that are associated with dog rescues. I've been putting out Twitter requests with my invitation to participate on Twitter with hashtags that are connected to dog rescues. And I've also been sending emails to rescue organizations that have foster providers in them. So that's a part of my decisions about who should respond. So part of that is I have dictated they need to be people who have in the past or who are currently fostering dogs. Not people who've just sort of thought about it, but people who are or have been foster providers. Eventually, in a lot of survey research, you do have to select a sample. Now, if I were in an ideal world where I had a perfect list of all human beings who provide foster care for dogs, I would pull a representative sample. I don't have that list, so I don't get to take that third step here to do appropriate sampling. In a lot of survey research, though, let's say I'm a political scientist, I can get a list of especially if I'm working with through a government agency and they want to find some valid and reliable information about registered voters, that list of registered voters can be obtained and those people can be solicited. In other forms of research, if you have access, and some of my students have done this in their SEE research, if they want a representative sample of students at the University of Mount Union who are currently enrolled, you can go into the email system and select at random, 250 email addresses, and then attempt to pull a sample in that way. Now, of course, that approach has a number of problems that make it difficult to make the statement that the sample will eventually be representative, and that's why you have to check. You have to look at the demographics of the people who eventually do respond and ask yourself the hard question, are they actually representative? So based on your understanding of the demographics of the population, so let's say the population is all Mount Union students, what if you get 80% of the people who actually respond to your survey are female? But you know that the population of Mount Union students who are currently enrolled is not 80% female. Then you have a representativeness problem and a response rate problem in a subset of your sample. There's some basic terminology to learn when you're thinking about sampling. First off, we use the word population very precisely. It defines all possible cases of interest. So a lot of times with my SEE students, they are restricted to the population of currently enrolled Mount Union students in their research. So that would be the population in that case. If I'm that hypothetical political scientist interested in the Ohio electorate. All registered voters in the state of Ohio might be how I define my population. I could, though, define it more broadly. All people potentially eligible to vote in the state of Ohio could be the way I'd choose to define my population of interest. The sampling frame is whatever concrete actual list. So population is somewhat hypothetical. A sampling frame is the list you have available to you. So let's say I'm interested as a political scientist in all potentially eligible voters in the state of Ohio as my population. My sampling frame might be relegated to just those who are registered, because then they have actual contact information for me to access. Or you could define it differently. I'm interested in, all potentially eligible voters. I find a way to randomly send out requests for a survey using telephone numbers. This used to be very commonplace with landlines. My husband is one of those who still wants a landline. During election season, we usually end up having to unplug the landline because we still get cold calls from polling agencies who want to know our opinions. So your sampling frame can be defined in a lot of different ways. Regardless of how it's defined, it's whatever concrete list you can come up with for contacting the members of a given population. Then you have a sample, and a sample is a subset of individuals that you pull. So let's say that you have a population, whatever the population of Ohio is, and then your sampling frame, you have, a very, very large possible list of people to contact, and you say for the purposes of your research, you're going to randomly make requests of 1,500 people. So the sample would be that 1,500 that you decide to pull out of the sampling frame and actually call. And then the element, I don't know why they call it an element. It's a participant. It's a person. Each member of the population is an element. So in your sampling frame is made up of elements within the population. The sample is made up of elements that actually get sampled and who provide data from that overarching population. Now, for those of us who are visual learners, I pulled this image from your chapter. Just gives you an example. If you look at the outer box, the population, and it's very similar to the example I gave you earlier, all students on campus. Then you have a sampling frame. The registrar's list of currently enrolled students refines it down to that. And then the sample, you decide to pull 100 students from that registrar's list. And then an element is a single student from that sample. Now, samples, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots and lots of possible sources of bias in survey research, just like in all research. All methodologies are vulnerable to bias of various forms, but we do have to be very careful when we're doing survey research to think about the major threats to representativeness. And the biggest one is when you end up with a biased sample. So remember that example that I used earlier. What if I find out after I pull my sample and I send out invitations to participate and it comes back that I have 80% of my respondents are female, when I know that the population is much more balanced than that in reality, and I know that the sample that I actually pulled of people to contact with my survey was more balanced than that, then I have a bias problem because my data will be slanted in that direction. Psychology research that relies on undergraduates has a big problem with with the bias based on sex in terms of response rates in survey research, and also in terms of people willing to sign up for experimental research. So we have to be kind of aware of that and on guard for it, and try to come up with some compensatory strategies for reducing that bias. So basically, a biased sample is one where you have the distribution of traits and attributes in the sample is different in a meaningful way from the target population. So just as the example I was just giving you, what if you end up with 80% of your respondents being female? When you know that the underlying population is more like, 52% female versus 48% male, and I'm making that up off the top of my head. So we know systematically there's a problem there. You could have overrepresentation of a particular group or underrepresentation of another group. There may be a problem with how people are being recruited, how they're being interacted with, and so on. The typical categories of sources of bias, you have selection biases. So here, the researcher's tactics for selecting a sample could be problematic. For example, if pollsters want to get information about the electorate, calling landlines works for people my age and older more often than it works for anyone else. So sometimes when I tell my students I have a phone that's plugged into my wall, they kind of look at me like they have no idea what I'm talking about. I once showed a picture of the phone jack in my wall and asked students if they could identify it, and they were like, I have no idea what that is. Yeah. So let's say you are that pollster and you're only using landline numbers to try and contact the electorate. Well, all of your data is going to be more strongly representative of individuals who are of an age where still having a landline telephone is normal, or is normative, or who have a stable residence. So these days, there would be several pockets of your population that you're clearly missing. Young people who have never and probably will never have a landline phone. Individuals who have transient housing will not have a landline phone. And people who not just have transient housing but are homeless or who are students typically are not going to have a landline phone that can be accessed and used for survey purposes. Same with addresses. So sending out a survey in the mail used to be a commonplace thing, or sending it out through email. It's typical these days to have, some segments of the population are more responsive to email than others. So for example, with students, we often have difficulty getting students to respond to surveys when email is the entry point for those surveys. Because, think about yourselves, email may be down your list of things to pay attention to first, whereas text messages may be a much quicker way to get people's attention. So any of those problems can create selection bias, where certain elements of the population are kind of systematically not attended to. And then you have response rate biases, and this is more like the example I was describing earlier, where I have females tending to respond to research requests on college campuses far more often than male students respond to research requests. The bottom line is basically that however you choose to define a representative sample is going to depend on the population that you've pinpointed as your population of interest. Your job as a good researcher is to get a clear understanding of the nature of that population and your access points for being able to sample from that population of interest. Knowing that some populations are very easy to access, whereas other populations are extraordinarily difficult. So your research will have to take those factors into consideration. There are a number of approaches to sampling, and your authors go into this not in a a crazy amount of detail. But generally speaking, there are a couple of broad approaches to selecting samples. You can do so with probability sampling or non-probability sampling. Essentially, probability sampling is more likely to yield representative samples. So my research on foster providers for dog rescues is not probability sampling because I don't have access to a proper sampling frame. I don't have a list that I can work with and then pull a representative sample. Probability sampling allows you to actually do such things as simple random sampling, where you're going to have a handle on the elements of the population, and each element in that population has an equal opportunity to be pulled as it being included in the sample. So again, element means participant. So each potential participant has an equal likelihood of being sampled. Stratified random sampling is a little more complicated than simple random sampling. Basically, you have a population that has a number of different subpopulations. You want to make sure that you sample randomly from each of those subpopulations, which are sometimes called strata. Now, in my research, I have a difficult to pin down population, so and it's often a population that's constantly changing in membership. I have to use what's often called convenience sampling. So whatever way I can get into the door and get respondents, that's how I get in the door. So it's through non-probability sampling. I'm not using a random procedure because I do not have a list to create a formal sampling frame. What that means is I have to be very transparent when I write up this research, that I can't make any guarantee that every element, every possible participant in the study had an equal chance of being included. Since I have to heavily rely on social media and email in my recruiting, I am leaving out people who do not use those methods of communication. And there are a lot of them, quite a lot, who, and my methodology is an internet survey. So who am I missing? All the foster providers who are not, likely to be online or able to access an online questionnaire. Now, I pulled this image from your chapter just to remind you. It gives you some steps for drawing random samples. So I pulled the image so that you'll remember when you are in your chapter, take a look at this and read through, because it gives you a nice set of questions that you would have to ask as you take the steps for drawing a random sample for a survey type study. There are a variety of methods, tools that we can use. There are also a variety of designs that we can use when we are conducting survey research. Some of the more common survey techniques that are out there, although since the advent of internet surveys, some of these things, like I can't remember the last time I got a questionnaire in the mail that wasn't the U.S. Census. Mail surveys that came in, like the Postal Service, to a mailbox used to be really, really common. Early in my career, we had to make a budget for postage and copying because all of our surveys were responded to using the mail. That's not very common at all anymore. Personal interviews have also changed a bit in recent years. We still do a lot of face-to-face interviewing, but now we have the capacity to do online interviewing with video technologies. Telephone interviews still do occur, although it's become more difficult with privacy rules about cell phone numbers. It's become more difficult for researchers to randomly generate lists of phone numbers, or to access lists of phone numbers that are stable and reliable. such that they can get a truly random sample. And then, of course, there are internet surveys, and I'm sure you've filled out a lot of online surveys in your lives already. Each of these approaches has costs and benefits, advantages and disadvantages. Essentially, the choice of which to do really is wholly dependent on the nature of your research question and then the pragmatic issues of what is most likely to yield for you the type of data that you need to answer your question. There are a number of ways to increase your response rate, regardless of which technique you're using, but there are some, the ones your authors give you are general ways to increase your response rate. Others are more tailored to your specific mechanism. So, some of the tips and techniques for mail surveys versus telephone surveys versus personal interviews are going to differ depending on the context. But generally, questionnaires tend to be responded to more when there are some ways that the potential respondent can connect personally to the questions being asked. If you keep the ability to respond, if you keep, say, your number of questions relatively low, if you tell the person up front how much time it's going to take them, and so that their expectations are met, if they are interested in the topic that you are studying, and if you have sponsoring organizations that person values, that can be helpful for encouraging participation. So we'll go back to the issue of bias. I did say we were going to talk about bias routinely within this chapter. So potential biases when we're doing survey research, one of the real challenges is low response rates. So if you're doing a survey and you're getting 10, 15, 20 when what you wanted was 500, that low response rate is a real risk to your whole study, because when you have a really low response rate, you can't count on that sample of people being representative since so few actually responded. And then you also have to be careful about what's called interviewer bias. And we don't mean just face-to-face personal interviews, but also phone interviews, and in some cases video chat interviews, where you have the interviewer who's note-taking and is kind of selecting what to remember, what to write down, what to record. And this is one reason that a lot of interview researchers, people who do focus groups, who will generate actual transcript records. So by recording with audio and or video, then you eliminate some of the possibility of interviewer bias, because you are recording faithfully everything, and then you can make more theoretical based decisions about data analysis without having to rely on your potentially biased ability to record responses. So that concludes part 1 of chapter 5. I'll see you again when we do part 2.